became Catholic. Right? A few times.
All right, I just started the recording, so that means we've begun. So welcome to another week of exploring the world religions minus Christianity. As always, we are exploring the basic beliefs and practices of these different faiths. We're exploring how religions are often the same in some ways and how they're different in other ways. And as always, I invite you to ponder any questions that come to your mind, including this kind of basic question of comparative religion are they different paths to the same destination or just different paths? That's not one we answer. It's just one you could ponder, and we'll be discussing it. Today, we're turning to our third religion. We've done Hinduism the first week, Buddhism 2 weeks ago, break last week, and now we're turning to the first of the three Abrahamic religions, as they're referred to, and that is Judaism. And the other two, of course, are Christianity and Islam. These three religions are called Abrahamic because they all in some way link themselves to Abraham as a forefather. They all share a belief in monotheism, and we also share certain stories and narratives and characters in our scriptures and some practices too. Judaism, of course, is an especially interesting religion to study because it's where Christianity grew out of. In fact, some would even say Christianity is a version of like a reformed Judaism in a way, or a spin off that. So a very related phase. Before I begin the video, I want to just make one note about the terms we're going to use today. Alongside Judaism, sometimes the form of the word you'll use is Jews or Jewish. And of course, that word can have multiple connotations. When I'm using it today, I'm using it in the religious sense rather than the ethnic or the cultural sense. Not to say that ethnic and cultural sense isn't tied to the religious sense, but of course, someone could be culturally Jewish without being religiously Jewish. Someone could be ethnically Jewish and, again, not necessarily religiously Jewish. So interrelated things sometimes, but also distinct things. And we're using the religious sense of the word. We're also going to continue with this video series, which does a wonderful job. This lady teaching about the basics to start out. This one must be the first of her series because she kind of does a little intro, which you could say is not relevant, but I really love what she says because it's one of the points I want to lift up, which is to say, and I think I've said it in different ways, religions may share a lot in common, but to say they're exactly the same is not a version of appreciating them. If you came to a Muslim, for instance, and you said, are you the same as Hindus? Muslims are radically monotheistic. Hindus usually are not. They would not see them as the same religions. They may share some teachings, but they wouldn't say we're the same. And so part of appreciating things is recognizing the distinctiveness, while also it's reasonable also to recognize some of that similarity. But she goes into a little of that about what it means to study a religion in and of itself without kind of boiling it all down to the same thing. So I'm going to leave that in because I think it's pretty well stated. So I will turn this on and see how this goes.
You want the light?
Sure, we could do the light off.
And ultimately controversial topics that we can discuss. Today we are going to tackle one of the most important, influential, and ultimately controversial topics that we can discuss: religion. I know that supposedly religion and race and politics are topics you shouldn't talk about, but here we go. And let's be honest, perhaps our polarized political climate and misunderstandings about different religions and racial issues really come from a place that we don't talk about it. So let's talk about religion from a historical lens. I'm not going to tell you to follow one religion or another or critique different belief systems. I just want you to be educated, and I want you to understand these different cultural beliefs. and for the sake of Jesus and Muhammad and the Buddha and Confucius and everyone else, that you analyze what their teachings were instead of maybe what got institutionalized by different governments over the years. But like, aren't all religions the same? I'm going to stop you right there. No. I feel like this is what uneducated, simple-minded people say. And I mean that in a really nice way. Are there similarities? Absolutely. Do they look for meaning and purpose in life? Yes. Do they turn to a higher power? Often that is true. But to say that they're the same overlooks each religion's uniquenesses and beauty in an effort to not get in a debate and pretend that they're all the same. It's like people who say, I don't see color, to prove that they're not racist. Really? Like if we're sitting at a restaurant with a diverse group of friends, you wouldn't see that my friend is black? Do you just show everything in one single skin tone? Some strange like Instagram filter embedded in your eyeballs? So, in the same way, these simple sayings overlook the beauty, the uniquenesses, the differences between varying beliefs and experiences. So there you have it. We've tackled religion, race, and a little politics. So this should be good. Let's dig into Judaism. Judaism began nearly 4,000 years ago in the Middle East, specifically in the land around Ur, or ancient Mesopotamia. If you were going to pinpoint the beginning of the story, you would look at a Hebrew man named Abraham. Jews believe that God, known as Yahweh, revealed himself to Abraham. The story goes that God promised him that he would make him, Abraham, into a great nation and that he would bless them. He also promised them actual land. In class, we're going to kind of circle back to this idea, as you may be vaguely familiar with the idea of the promised land and the tricky modern issues with the literal land of Israel. The promise in the relationship between Yahweh and Abraham is known as the covenant. It's this special relationship based on reciprocal love and loyalty. Think of it like a promise to have each other's back. But not just for Abraham, but for the entire Jewish community. You see, Judaism is a monotheistic religion, meaning they believe in one God, Yahweh. All these teachings and stories are written down in the Tanakh, which is actually a Hebrew acronym if you were to break it down, which stands for the Torah, which are the first 5 books of Moses, and then also the book of the prophets, and then other writings as well. Often the Torah is famous as it outlines the story of God or Yahweh's relationship with the Jewish people. It discusses people like Noah and how Abraham migrated to the land of Canaan, or Moses leading the people out of slavery in Egypt, along with instructions about how to worship and give sacrifices and right living. Also, the Torah, those first 5 books, were memorized and recited orally for generations before it was actually written down, which is pretty impressive. I've seen people mess up the Pledge of Allegiance, which is 31 whole words, which is much less than the 5,800 verses, full sentences in the Torah. So where do Jews worship? You need to remember their history began as frequently being forced from their homeland and migrating to new lands. So they worshipped wherever they were. Around 1000 BCE, they built a holy temple in Jerusalem where they worshipped. Unfortunately, the Babylonians then came in and destroyed it in 587, and many Jews again fled the land. Remember Cyrus the Great, the Persian king? He allowed the Jews to return to this land, and then they rebuilt that temple in Jerusalem, making it known as the Second Temple. However, the Romans came along and then destroyed it in 70 CE, some 500 years later after it was rebuilt. They did this because the Jewish people were rebelling against the Roman Empire, which obviously they weren't a fan of, and many Jewish communities were massacred and were barred from the city. It's not been rebuilt since then. Today, many Jews travel to Jerusalem to go to the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, which is the only remains of the Second Temple, and it is held as a holy site. Today, Jews worship in synagogues or temples, which are Jewish prayer and learning spaces, and their leaders are known as rabbis. Within Judaism, there's a lot of different branches or sects. For time's sake, I can't get into them all, but if you hear the word Orthodox Jews or conservative Jews or Reform, those are the basic divisions, the biggest being between Orthodox and non-Orthodox movements. These branches differ in how they interpret Jewish law and the idea of the Messiah. If you were to rewind to the times before the Second Temple was destroyed, some of the Jewish religious branches included the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and even eventually Christians, which again we'll talk more about in the Christianity video. The major beliefs of Judaism focus on this covenant relationship between God and his people. They have several holidays that commemorate events in their history, such as the Passover, which celebrates their freedom from slavery in Egypt, and Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, where the people were made right before God through prayer and fasting and sacrifices at the temple. On that note, during the time of the first and the second temple, there were various types of sacrifices, including grain and burnt offerings and animal sacrifices. This doesn't happen today since there is no temple, but the goal was for the people to draw near to God. Think of these sacrifices as a means of obtaining forgiveness and were used as a symbol of the people being repentant. Do know that these offerings could be eaten by either the priests or the people offering them, and before PETA gets involved, if you eat meat, animals dying is kind of involved in that. Jewish beliefs were diffused all throughout the world, but not because people converted to Judaism. It isn't a universal religion that seeks converts. Simply, the people who were Jewish moved to a new place, because throughout history they had been persecuted by various groups: Babylonians, Romans, Christians later in history, and during the Middle Ages, and most infamously with Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust. Many people say this happened because Jews focused on remaining a separate cultural group rather than maybe taking on the religious and social customs of their conquerors. Since we are looking through a historical lens, we need to remember that Judaism is one of the oldest religions in the world. Judaism was very patriarchal for sure, with women having different responsibilities than men. Women's role was clearly as wife and as mother and as keeper of the household. Women couldn't be rabbis, traditionally speaking, but there are very famous women within Judaism in the story of their faith and in their holy writings. Today, many Jewish branches also allow women to be rabbis as well. We could dig so much deeper into this, but I hope this gives you a good overview of Jewish beliefs. Thanks for tuning in. If you find this helpful, give us a like or subscribe below. Also, check out the other videos in this series about world religions.
All right. Great. All right. So as we always do, we're going to now circle back at some of the things she talked about. I obviously invite your questions anytime they pop up. So we'll just start going through, and probably some of your initial questions might be answered as we go. But as she said, the origins of Judaism is it's not Adam and Eve. Some people say, oh, the first one in Adam and Eve in the Bible is Adam and Eve. No, it's Abraham, because everyone's related to Adam and Eve theoretically. It's Abraham who is the distinctive forefather of the Jewish people, and so he's thought to have lived in Mesopotamia between 2100 and 1800. We used to say BC or BCE. They date that based on the kingdoms and cities they're talking about in the Old Testament, as we'd call it. A summary statement: the one true God has revealed himself through his covenant with his chosen people, i.e. the Jewish people, that through them all might be blessed and find, we're going to use the word shalom, which is this kind of peaceful state of being in the world. We'll talk more about that. So a distinctive God, not a vague, we're not sure which God, but a distinctive image of God who then is seeking to instruct his people, his chosen people, to be his image in the world so that others can learn from that image, is sort of the mindset there. Judaism is generally held to be the world's oldest monotheistic religion. Noah, you know what monotheistic means, right?
Yeah.
What is that?
Like just one God.
One God, exactly. So they believe in only one God, not many gods. So in Judaism, God is a singular entity who created and sustained all things. Unlike in Eastern religions where we were talking about. Remember, in Hindu, the idea of enlightenment, moksha, heaven, is being reunited with the absolute God, Brahman, as we talked about. And in the end, it's like God and you and table and plant, everything's the same thing. In Judaism, not to say there's a vast separation, but there is a distinction. There's a creator and there are the created, and those two things are not the same thing within Judaism. That being said, in Judaism, God is far from distant or passive or disinterested. In fact, God is depicted as deeply connected to God's creation and personally invested, right? Personally involved with returning it to a state of peace and harmony known as shalom. So it's not a far off creator God, it's a close up creator God who's intimately in relationship or wants to be with the creation. God is also, in broad strokes speaking, depicted as good, just, and kind of you start to get a unique thing in Judaism at the time, very concerned with the vulnerable and oppressed, which was not often the way religion told the story of who God is. Core beliefs, we already said the first big one, monotheism, right? In this, you have to remember, it's not just monotheism among other monotheists, it's monotheism in a world of ancient times where everyone was either polytheist or pantheist, right? So they're kind of the only ones speaking about the monotheistic idea. One of Judaism's primary teaching is that there's, again, that one true Almighty God, Shaddai, though some Jews, especially in ancient times, probably believed in other supernatural beings, even maybe under gods, but they wouldn't be called the creator, right? These are, if you read like the book of Job, there's a court of celestial beings and stuff. So it's not that they didn't believe in a spiritual world outside of God. It's just that they wouldn't call that God. They'd call that, other kinds of things. So something about what I'm going to do today, she mentioned the name of God begins with a Y, an A, an H. So Jews don't say that name out loud. You'll notice there's G and then a space and D. That's another way of representing that. It's considered blasphemous because of God's vastness to pin God down with a name. And so they don't actually say that. If you enter a Jewish context in which they want to refer to that, they'll say Adonai, which means Lord. And that's the fill-in term so that you don't use God's name. God's name, that Y word, is held to mean something like I am or to be. So this absolute reality, right? The name of God is absolute reality in a sense. But they use the word Adonai. So I'm just, as a respect thing, going to kind of use that, either God or Adonai, when we want to talk about that. What would be like a basic confession of Jewish faith? Well, they have something called the Shema. Shema means to listen, and it goes, Shema, O Israel, which is listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So that would be kind of a shorthand confession of the Jewish faith. It is inspired from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, 4 and 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. There's the same thing. And then it actually goes on with a very familiar text, I think, for us. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. So that's kind of the boiled down statement of faith of Judaism. And again, this refrain describes the spirit of Judaism, which is a call to be reflections of God's image, right? God has a character, has an image, and then we can reflect that down. Namely, the Jewish people can reflect that down. And there's a word for Jewish people living in right relationship, where they're reflecting God's image back to the world, and that word is covenants, covenant relationship. In the Hebrew scriptures, the covenant relationship, as she said it well, a mutual relationship of love and loyalty between God and between God's chosen people. So God promises to faithfully care for God's people, and God's people promise to faithfully follow, worship, obey God. One of my professors who taught about this, Christians sometimes misunderstand that as a conditional thing, like a if then, like if you're faithful, then God will be your God. That's not how it's stated. It's because God is faithful, not God might be. God is faithful to you. Therefore, you are called to be faithful as well. Paul actually struggles with that in the book of Romans because many of Jewish people have not converted to Christianity. And he's been a Pharisaical Jew, which is like, we're people of the covenant. And he struggles in one of the chapters with, are the Jews still included? And at the end of it, he says, even though they should turn to Jesus, he's a Jew speaking this, he says, in the end, they will be saved. All Israel will be saved because the covenant cannot be undone. So it's not conditional. It's gratitude. Because God will be faithful to you, you are called to be faithful back to God, live in covenant relationship. Traditionally, Jews believe this relationship was initiated by God at Mount Sinai. We remember the story. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, meets God face to face, receives the tablets, which have the Ten Commandments, brings them back down to the people. They have kind of this rite of embracing, initiating the covenant, and then there's many other instructions that come after the Ten Commandments. But that's sort of the inauguration of the covenant. I said the law. The Ten Commandments are a slice of that. The law is a word both for a particular section of Jewish scriptures and a catch-all term for God's way of life, God's commandments, God's instructions, which he has given to the Jewish people to define what covenant living looks like. And to kind of shorthand what it's about, on the one hand, the law of the covenant is a call away from sin and idolatry. Interesting, the word sin that we use for sin in the Hebrew Bible is like het. Het is a archery word that literally means missing the mark. So sin is missing the mark of who we're called to be. And then idolatry is kind of in Jewish theology, it's thought that all sin, all missing the mark at its deepest level is a form of idolatry. Because the idea is anything bad in the world, whether it's violence, whether it's drug addiction, whether it's love of money, you're worshiping something instead of God. I'm worshiping revenge. I'm worshiping my wealth. I'm worshiping my ego, whatever it is. And you can kind of do that with any bad thing. It's not just a bad thing, but it's a elevation of a thing in God's place that isn't God. So that's kind of the mindset of what sin is. That's why idolatry is such a big theme in the Hebrew Bible. It's not just about don't worship a statue, but it's about this impulse we all have to elevate things that are not God into God's place. And then that's what it's a call away from. It's a call to shalom. Shalom, you may know it as a greeting of Jewish people. Shalom, we shorthand it as peace, but it's important to understand it's not just peace as in non-war. It's peace as in a vision of creation where there's a state of peace in creation through living in harmony with God's law, which in turn allows one to live in harmony with God, with neighbor, and with the world itself. So it's perfect, harmonious life for everyone and everything, not just the Jews and not just humans, but everything in the place that it needs to be, living in the way that it should live. And so that, if we wonder, well, how do you know what the covenant law looks like? That's where we get to the Jewish scriptures, which we're going to talk about now. Before we do, are there any questions about anything we just shared? Some of it may be vaguely familiar or very familiar.
I feel I'm filling in a lot of blanks for me,
Yeah.
for sure.
I'm talking about Paul. Excuse me. I don't think about Paul as being Jewish because he's so very much part of the New Testament.
Yeah.
But
He's uber Jewish. I mean, he was a Pharisee. Yeah, he's very Jewish.
yeah, but wasn't he Saul?
Yes.
Wasn't he Saul? And then he was converted on the road to
Yes.
to
Emmaus. No, that's the road to Damascus. Sorry.
Yeah. And then he became a Christian, I guess.
Correct.
Okay.
In a dramatic event.
And we'll maybe talk about this in another context, but one of the interesting things there is, did he think of himself as he was Jewish and then he wasn't anymore? Or did he think of himself as he was Jewish and he understood in one way, and then that story got fulfilled? Jesus too, I mean, one of his famous quotes is, I did not come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. So that's one of the things that I think Christianity historically has done a disservice to our heritage, which is Jewish heritage, to draw this strict line between the two and say, well, we're no longer this at all. Well, Jesus didn't say that's what it was. And Paul, I think he turned away from a version of almost violent extremist Judaism, but I'm not sure if he would have said he turned away from that heritage. He would have said, I renewed it. I understood it in a new way, and I'm fulfilling it, or part of.
Didn't he persecute, possibly kill Christians before his conversion?
Right.
I mean, so he was quite a radical Jewish.
He was a radical version of what it, and probably not all Jews at that time were that, but he was an extremist element.
He became a number one Christian because he has so much work in the New Testament.
Sometimes that's how it goes. The writer of Amazing Grace was a slave driver before he was an abolitionist. So you never know what God's going to do with people. Any other questions? No? All right, let's keep going. While we're doing it, just so that you can concurrently do this, this is the Wailing Wall, which is the only surviving area of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Observant Jews will go there and offer prayers because it's the best they have, right? So this is considered a very holy site. A picture of a Torah, which is even to this day handwritten in ink. They take very long time to produce. We visited a synagogue with our confirmation class. They talked about how they're tens of thousands of dollars because they're one piece of parchment. They don't touch them because of skin oil. So you'll see they have this metal finger thing where they'll point. And so every synagogue will have a altar area where there's a case and the Torah comes out of it, and they read from the Torah with these big wooden pegs attached to them. We're going to talk about some of the more traditional Jewish sects. So this is probably an Orthodox Jewish group with the black hats and the beards and stuff, and then a picture of a particular synagogue. This one's in England, but you can kind of see the menorah and some of that symbolism. So I'll just pass that around so y'all can take in some of that. But okay, we're talking about covenant. You live in the covenant by following the law. How do you know the law? Well, there's two big answers. Jews divide the scriptures, the word, into the written word, which they call the Torah, or the bigger collection is the Tanakh, a collection of written scriptures which are roughly analogous to what Christians call the Old Testament. And then this is very important, which we often don't understand this, the oral word, which is called the Talmud, which is a collection of still writings, but they were orally transmitted writings, a collection of writings by Jewish teachers called rabbis, which interpret the written Torah. So we're going to come back to that distinction and the importance of both in a second. But Jews divide the written word, or the Torah, or the Tanakh, into three categories. The Pentateuch, aka the Torah, the book of Moses. Pentateuch means the five. So these are the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. These, as she shared, are creation stories of the patriarchs, as well as the moral and social codes that originally instructed the first wave of Judaism. The prophets, the Navi'im, sorry about pronunciation, but these books are spiritual critiques of the spiritual community, the religious community, from within the same religious community. And that's one of the brilliant things about Judaism. It critiques itself, or at least it critiques the harmful versions of itself. And so common themes include, critiques of idolatry, social injustices, especially towards the vulnerable, and also some of the promises of deliverance. Some of the stuff about a Messiah is in there. These are books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and also some of what we call historical books, Samuel and Kings, because these have like Elijah, and some of these people are mentioned in them. And then what they refer to as the writings, or the Ketuvim. These include poetic and wisdom books such as Psalms and Proverbs, as well as certain historical books of some of the kings like Chronicles. Written scriptures, we're a little bit familiar with that. We're less familiar with the oral scriptures, the Talmud. These are a collection, again, of rabbinical writings which interpret the Torah. It's important to understand that while religious Jews hold the written Torah in great esteem. The vast majority consider the oral word, the Talmud, to be of essentially equal standing, right? The view is without the Talmud, one lacks the context and the tradition to properly understand the Torah. So think of the Torah as the treasure, but to unlock the treasure, you have to have the key, which is the Talmud. So it's absolutely, it's not like you could do the Talmud or just go straight to it. No, you need the Talmud. And this points to another interesting thing about Judaism, at least of the last 1500 years, which is that scriptural literalism, or there's a term from the Reformation, sola scriptura, we only go straight to scripture. That's not a big tradition in Jewish faith. Rather, Jews believe in layers of meaning, not necessarily the most obvious literal meaning. Judaism as a whole is a spiritual landscape, even its conservative versions, in which questions, conversation, and even creativity are valued. The rabbis get together with each other or with the students. They discuss, they say, what is this? And they ask questions. Some of you may remember in the scriptures, when Jesus is asked a question and he's called rabbi, he often answers a question with a further question. So he was in that school of spirituality too. So, to kind of hone in on what this looks like, if you ever come across a particularly harsh section of the Torah, the Old Testament, where maybe someone commits a sin and they're supposed to be stoned to death, and then you look at the history of Judaism for the last 2,000 years, and actually they're not doing that. And you might wonder, well, why is that? And that's because generally they're not reading it literally. They're finding symbolic meanings. They're saying this word has a deeper meaning than we at first realize. They're saying the context has changed. So reform and almost like creative theology is built into Judaism, really all forms, whether it's a liberal Judaism or a traditional Judaism, that Talmud creativity is built into the faith. So here's a few quotes from the Talmud. So these are, based not necessarily on just one passage, but in the spirit of the Torah, but sayings of the Talmud from rabbis. The disciples of the wise are engaged all their days in the building up of the world. Another one, the less the merits of a person are, the more he will feel urged to proclaim them in public. I love that one. He who turns away from the works of love and charity turns away from God. Okay?
Yeah.
This one's hilarious. It's about gossip. Thy friend has a friend, and thy friend's friend has a friend. Be discreet. So it's going to get around. People know each other, so don't gossip. Few sayings, and there's many. It's a big document. Any questions about that? Because that's one of really the core distinctions. I don't want to say we don't have an interpretive history, but there are lots of Christians who believe just go straight to the Bible, no other discussions, just go straight to literalism in the Bible, just fundamentalism, and Judaism in many ways is not that. And maybe some versions of Christianity aren't either, but there's been a lot of that in Christian history, more so than in Jewish history, that kind of sola scriptura thing. Any questions or comments on any of that?
Is the Talmud, is that written down into a book form?
Yes, you can go buy the Talmud.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, that was my next question then. If you were Jewish, would you keep a copy of the Torah and the Talmud, and what was the other one? Would you keep copies of those in your house so that you could
I
read
think, yeah, you would, potentially if you're, highly observant, but I think a real Torah is what's in the synagogue on the scrolls. So in a sense of the word real, like that's how it really, and it's in Hebrew as well. It's part of the thing, but certainly you could read translations and learn from that in your own tongue and
Would
stuff.
you have to learn Hebrew to be good Jewish?
So actually we went to the synagogue recently, and it was actually a more progressive one. And the whole service is pretty much scriptural prayers and like Psalms, and they're all sung and they're in Hebrew. Yeah. So it's kind of turning to that heritage. And that's why when I said I'm using Jewish in the religious sense, not the culture ethnic, you can only say that partially because they're very tied up to each other, tied in with each other. Yeah.
So with the Talmud, since it's like a continual, does the Talmud have new additions because, as time goes on, as new rabbis make commentaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tradition of rabbis continues. I don't think they're adding to the traditional Talmud, but there's a further document called Midrash, which is a commentaries on the Talmud. So you have a commentary on the
Commentary.
commentary on the commentary, and that tradition. So it's a living tradition. It's not dead. You can almost think of that as a debate about like the Supreme Court. Is it just written, or do you keep exploring it, asking the question, what does it mean today? Judaism as a whole, in general, is more of it's still alive, and we still discuss what it looks
There was
like.
a comment, and I think it was talking about midrash, whatever, but it was like, a successful sermon or whatever they call it in their thing.
Yeah.
Is one where the people walking out are arguing.
Yes, yeah, and that's almost a cliche, but I think Jewish. I've heard comedians talk about it. Jewish comedians like debating, arguing.
Yeah.
It's actually often in Jewish culture. It's not seen as bad. It's not seen.
Yeah.
It's like you're
Dialogue.
growing your mind. You're learning. You're joking. You know, that's part of the culture here, and so you can really see that in.
So we're
In
gonna
what
start
we're
doing
talking
that.
Sounds good to me. I'm actually a naturally argumentative person, so that's perfect for me. Yeah.
Now,
Oh, yeah.
does it follow the mother? I've heard that, if your mother is Jewish, then you're Jewish.
I don't want to speak. I don't know the answer, and I would guess it's where you live and how the community around you. You're talking about like a mixed marriage situation, because
Right.
otherwise, yeah, that would kind of depend on the tradition, because some traditions you're not supposed to do that. So, and then in a modern tradition, people probably negotiate that in all kinds of different ways. And of course, people marry who they want sometimes, despite what their family says. So,
What
I
I've
don't
heard,
think there's one way.
what I've heard was, if your mother is Jewish, then you're Jewish. But if she's not Jewish, then you're not Jewish.
That may be the case.
That's
I
what-
don't know. Yeah,
That's what I've heard.
I'll bow to your insight
Major
there.
ignorant.
But I'm guessing in actuality, people do all kinds of different things, right? Yeah.
When I lived in Hollywood, I just made so many mistakes. We, because we lived 2 blocks from the ultra conservative,
Hasidic.
Yeah.
Hasidic, community, and it was beautiful area, and I made big mistakes, like walking with my daughter wearing shorts
Yeah.
in
Sure.
the hot summer, and I'm thinking it's a beautiful area, and it's really nice, like, children
Yeah.
came running out saying, get out of here, get out. And
Right.
but then the dad came in, the black hat, and said, I'm so sorry. I mean,
Sure,
really
he's
very,
polite.
like,
Yeah, yeah,
very
yeah.
polite, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, oh my God.
Yeah, and
never
we're going to
occurred
talk
to
about
me,
that
yeah.
sense of, for some Jews, not all, but for some of the more conservative ones, separation to an extent being part of the faith, and why that is. It's really, I mean, there's always vindictive people of every stripe, but it's not in the spirit of vindictiveness. There's a reason how they see it.
It's a
So,
rule,
yeah.
The money,
Yeah.
the person can't, the person at the.
Can't handle the money.
Can't touch you.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
there's
yeah.
it's like sliding money
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah, and
rather
we
than
hear
to
about that in the
him.
gospel, the cleanliness, ritual cleanliness still lives
I
on
wonder where
in
that's
certain
coming from,
traditions.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when
Yeah.
I was in Rome, in Rome, many churches, if you were wearing shorts, they wouldn't let you in. I
Sure.
mean,
So it's not, yeah.
Many of the Christian churches in
Yeah.
Rome.
I'm gonna kick you out if you wear, but just you. No, I'm just kidding.
No,
Just
but I
kidding.
thought that was interesting. You just stopped you at the door and said, you can't come in because you
Yeah.
got shorts on.
Sure. Yeah. Or go into Islamic temple, a mosque, and
Oh,
try to
yeah.
wear shoes. You're not, there's different traditions there. Yeah. Okay. So where do Jews worship? She talked about this a little. So there's a big distinction between historical Judaism and even 1500 years ago Judaism, or the last 2000 years. Historically, there was a temple. Actually, before a temple, there were tents, but this is the place, we talked about it today in the sermon, where Jews would come and offer their sacrifices. That was seen as the centerpiece of Jewish religious life. Of course, the issue there was both temples got destroyed at different times, apart from the Wailing Wall, right? That's why that's considered a very holy site to many Jews. But that meant that you cannot have a temple-based religion once there's no temple. And so Jewish faith, it already had synagogues, and the rabbis or the Pharisees in the New Testament are already examples of more localized religious community, but it moved almost entirely to a more localized context. And so that's when synagogues became hugely important because that's what you had. And so those are, analogous to a Christian church for Jews, a place of religious gathering. There's often teachers, including rabbis, who may lead the services and instruct and assist families in that. Services are held on Sabbath, which let's remember Jewish Sabbath is Saturday. They'll refer to it usually as Shabbat, not Sabbath, but Shabbat.
It starts a Friday afternoon too. I remember working with coworkers.
Correct.
To leave.
Sundown to sundown.
Thank you.
The
Yes.
woman, yeah, had to leave to get
That-
food ready.
That's what we're talking about. Okay, so core practice is Shabbat, Sabbath, which is a time of spiritual and physical rest. Shabbat, it is said to be a reflection or a celebration of the creation narrative. On the seventh day, God's rests, sees that it's good. It's not a harsh rule thing. It's a celebrate what's good, focus on God, recharge, renew spiritually. As you said, it starts sundown Friday with a meal. It ends sundown Saturday with a meal. Meal-based spirituality is really big. On Sabbath, observant Jews, especially very traditional ones, would be expected to refrain from work, which can be translated in lots of different ways, but certainly your jobs, certain kinds of activities, again, depending on how traditional you are, you're expected to spend time with family and friends, often over ritual meals or meals with some ritual in them, and then you may attend services at synagogue as well. She mentioned there's a number of holidays, holy days in Judaism of festival meals, and you may go to synagogue on those. Also, we're familiar with some of them. Passover. There's in scriptures that mentions the festival of the booth that celebrates the giving of the law. So there's many different ones. We went to a Jewish New Year festival at a nearby synagogue last year. So different festivals that often have food oriented with them, ritual meals, and different forms of worship. And there's lots of practices in Judaism, so I'm not going to cover all of them. I encourage you to look into, bat mitzvahs and different things like that. One of the others that I did want to lift up, because I think it's highly relevant to some of the history, as she mentioned, is they say it in different ways, but remaining kosher, that applies to food, but also applies in some versions to people. We might use the term also within scripture, clean, ritualistic clean. Throughout history, more conservative Jews have heard the call to live within the covenant as a command to embrace a distinct moral and social identity. When the original covenant narrative is found in Genesis with Abraham, God will bless you to be a blessing to the nations. So you, as Jews, it's not just for you to have yourself, it's for you to bless others, but you only do that by being distinctive, by having a different identity. If you blend in with everything around you, you're not shining in any way, you're just blending in. And so that's why traditional Jews will say we have to maintain who we are, which necessarily means we can't mix and we can't live like everyone else. So these distinctive practices may include diet codes, right? Not eating pork, shellfish, stuff like that. Clothing, we saw the pictures of the brim hats, the beards, the kinds of hair, the way women dress in a very traditional version, head coverings and stuff, circumcision of boys. And then we mentioned this also alluded to in strict forms of Judaism, intermarriage is not allowed, or at least discouraged, because you're not going to be able to maintain that identity. And as she mentioned, in a lot of forms, there is maybe something called God-fears, which is someone who's not a Gentile who converts to Judaism. But in general, Judaism's not necessarily trying to convert, it's trying to embody, it's trying to shine in identity. And it wants the world to learn from that, but it's not necessarily, the chosen people are a distinct group who are not everyone. And so that's kind of where that comes from, as we talked about. And as you said, it's not for most people, they don't dislike Gentiles. It's just we have to maintain an identity so that we can be a light to the nations. Any questions there? I know this is a lot. Judaism has a lot. We'll finish up soon. Forms, she mentioned Reform Judaism. This is the largest affiliation in the U.S., 35%. This emphasizes the primacy of Jewish ethical traditions over like Jewish law. So not as much with diet and dress, who you can marry. It's been more open to adapting Jewish traditions to modern sensibilities. Generally speaking, Reform Jews align with a more political progressivism, social justice kind of stuff over like ritual observance. So that would be Reform Judaism. Think of it as the more modernized form of Judaism. Then you have conservative Judaism. This is a form that sees Jewish law as obligatory for Jews, though in practice there's a range of how they interpret what that means. They would maybe partially adapt. So like they may say it's okay to drive to synagogue on Shabbat, but nowhere else. You can only drive to
That is
synagogue.
which one again?
Conservative. It's actually the middle of
Okay.
the road. And they may have like mixed gender prayer would be something some would do. On other matters like keeping kosher, intermarriage, they tend to maintain the traditional line. And then the most strict would be Orthodox Judaism, which is an extreme adherence to a traditional understanding of Jewish law. As interpreted. They still use rabbinical authorities, by the way. That doesn't mean just scripture. It means Talmud also. And hallmarks of Orthodox religious life include strict observance of Shabbat, no driving, no working, no turning on or off electricity. Sometimes they'll create little technologies so that it does it automatically, so that, automated doors and stuff. Extreme kosher laws. Within them, there's an even more ultra-Orthodox who are those are the black hats and the way women dress and stuff like that, modest attire for women. And those types would have the lowest interaction with non-Jewish society because, again, you could become ritualistically unclean and you have to maintain your identity to an extreme level.
Question.
Yes.
Oh, so then is being Hasidic a subset of being?
Yeah,
Orthodox?
Hasidic's a version of Orthodox.
Okay.
And there are more than these. I'm just hitting the biggest ones, but yes, they're a version of Orthodox. Yeah.
So if a crime is committed,
Yeah.
who has final authority? Is it the rabbi or the? If
Like the
you're
Torah,
a
yeah.
Hasidic,
If it's like a big crime, I mean, most of those communities, they don't like have their own law court
Okay.
on like legal matters, though there may be some complexities there about when you could do things. But I should also say all forms of Judaism, I think I'm correct in saying, definitely see exceptions in extreme circumstances. If someone's shooting at you, you're allowed to open a door and run away. Like it's not so stringent that you can't make, or if you're starving or, you're allowed to prepare food or something. So it's not like you can't do anything under any circumstances, but think of these as normal circumstances, what you're supposed to do. Yeah.
Did you get to listen to that one thing I sent you a while back with that rabbi? I know you're.
No, I've been in and out.
But
Yeah.
And I'll just say quickly that this was a ritual I had not heard about. She was talking about how when people are mourning or depressed or whatever, how a lot of times you pull back and you don't feel like you're seen or else people are jumping in wanting to, oh, you'll be okay, you'll get
Yeah.
over it and all that kind of stuff. Well, she said, and this is a woman who started a community in California someplace.
Yes.
And they have where you come to a place and she does it like in a gym sometimes.
Yeah.
And if you are okay, if you're happy in your life, whatever, you go to the right. And if you're not, if you are down or mourning,
Yeah.
you go to the left. And then the people on the right walk one way and the people on the left walk another way. And you're called to look people in the eye and just acknowledge.
See their
them.
pain or their
Yeah,
joy or
just
whatever.
acknowledge.
Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what a wonderful
That is neat.
thing.
I
Yeah.
thought what you were going to say, one thing I do know of it is that like expressions of mourning, like very, sobbing are expected. You see that in the New Testament where people are very, and that's getting it out as opposed to the Northern European heritage. It's
Right.
good to get it out when you're grieving. You don't have to put it, push it
But
down.
how
So,
different things would be. I mean, and it's just,
Yeah.
and it was just about like acknowledging, accompanying, not trying to fix it,
yeah,
just.
just seeing
I
it
see
and
you.
acknowledging it. Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that.
and that
Yeah.
goes back to the words you said. Something, which is listen, shama.
Yeah, Shema, listen, yeah.
Maybe that, yeah.
Yeah, listen, yeah, pay attention.
Yeah.
Remembering's a big, and words can
Well,
mean
don't
different
you do
things, but
something
remembering.
after a year, after someone's passed away, isn't
Oh.
there a ceremony?
There may
that's-
be, yeah, I'm not sold, yeah. I don't know.
I went to the Jewish community center last Sunday. They were showing a documentary on the Catskills
Mm.
and how it was developed as a Jewish resort,
Retreat, yeah.
because most of the resorts there prior said Gentiles only.
Oh,
Yeah,
my,
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
there's
that-
been lots of anti-Semitism in our.
There was, and that part of the civil rights
New York.
bill actually addressed, they received
Interesting.
some things because of the civil rights bill, which also
Interesting.
Yeah,
dealt
they
with
had, there
the
was a lot,
Gentiles only.
there was a lot of prejudice. Miami Beach, was one of the first, vacation spots to open up to Jewish. And you wonder why there were so many Jewish there, is
It's a
because
huge
that was the
population.
first one.
I didn't know that, though. That's
Mm.
interesting.
Yeah, I'm aware of time, so if anyone needs to step away, I have a couple things left, but you're welcome to step away when you're ready to. The last thing I was gonna say about those traditions, both Orthodox and conservative believe in the future coming of a Messiah, but not Jesus, otherwise they'd be Christians. The restoration of the promised land and kind of a life after death thing. Reform Jews, it depends on kind of where they're at on any of those issues. The last thing I was just going to mention, we've talked about struggles, anti-Semitism's the big one. And that probably often stems from the fact that they live separately. It's easy to demonize another people who have very different ways of life, who don't necessarily mix in. We all know some of the history of that. And then also that very relevant to our own time, struggles in the Holy Land, because many Jews will see that is a place that's been promised to them, either all of it or just at least we have a right to be there. There's also even just secular versions of Zionism where we have a right to have a home that's safe for our own kind and celebrates our own identity. Of course, there's also other people who live there, the Palestinians. So I don't have any big answers to that, but just to point out, that's been a source of tension, is the heritage of a perceived promised land, because whenever two people want land, it's trouble. So I'll end it there. I'm going to end our recording there, and then any discussion we want to have after that, we're welcome. Or if y'all want to move on, that's okay too. But thank you for joining us, and I'll end the recording.
And I do want to share